Today we're talking about interviewing, that most essential craft skill of journalism. It's one of the building blocks in any journalism course. It's absolutely integral to the process of discovering, finding out information and questioning people in power. And today we're very lucky to have three of the very best exponents of the craft with us here to talk about it. Please join me in making welcome Emma Alberici, David Speers and Ramona Koval. And what fun it is to interview interviewers about interviewing. And the only format in which we could do it really is through an interview. If we'd done some boring set piece sort of recitation about interviewing, that wouldn't quite have worked. But the question I have is, what should be the first question? And so I'll turn that into a question. How important is the first question in an interview?
It's absolutely vital. It's the gateway to the experience you're going to have with the person. It will show them your bona fides. It will make them either relax in a sense that they think that they're with somebody who understands them or who's done the reading or who knows the area, but it won't put them off. It won't be too aggressive. It will save the more difficult, prickly things perhaps for later, depending on how long you've got. But it depends on who it is too. Is it a politician? Is it a writer? Is it a person in the street? Is it someone who's suffered some terrible misfortune that you don't want to be cruel to, but you still want them to be able to tell their story? It's really vital to get it right.
So are you relaxed now, Ramona?
I'm relaxed.
Wow, that's a success then. David?
Look, I agree with all of that. I mean, my stock and trade is politicians, and it really does depend on the interview. I mean, sometimes there's just an obvious question that all of the viewers are dying to ask the polly, so you've got to start with that, right? This is a no-brainer. Sometimes, though, you've done your research and you just want them to state their position first before you then come in with, what you've actually got in your back pocket. So the first question might be fairly mild, just for them to restate their position, and then comes the more detailed follow-ups, as you indicate. But it really does depend on the subject and the subject matter as to how hard you're going to go straight off the bat.
But sometimes, Emma, you want to take advantage of that moment where they're a little bit nervous to pounce, don't you? Sometimes that's useful.
As the first question, you mean?
Yeah.
Look, unfortunately, and politicians are often who I'm interviewing as well, they're not nervous anymore. They're so trained within an inch of their life. They have their talking points and they don't care what the first, the second or the seventh question is, because they've got a message and they can mould that message to whichever question you ask. So the challenge is often finding a question that won't suit their message or will circumvent the message in some respect so we can get them off their script. And that's part of the problem of modern day interviewing, trying to get them away from their set talking points. And, I know we all do it in the broadcast sense. We sometimes do those montages of, because it's so comical, of all of them saying the same thing, because obviously that was what they were told was the message of the day. And, to quote Ian Katz, I think it was, wrote, those interviews become boring snoring, those political interviews, because you know what they're all going to say.
That reminds me of something Sarah Ferguson said the other day in the keynote address, in the A.N. Smith lecture. She talked about Julia Gillard giving the perfectly formed answer to another question. So.
But I haven't interviewed politicians for many, many years, and I moved to interviewing artists and writers and poets because I just got completely sick of this weird dance that you would do. I'll do this and then you'll do that, and then I'll do that and you'll move. It was kind of like a cha-cha or a tango, and I just thought, really, I'm not. It just did my head in. I just wonder how you feel about that kind of predictability.
You walk that dance every afternoon, don't you?
Yeah, you do. I wouldn't describe it as a dance. I think Emma's right. You've got to think constantly of new ways of cracking through that spin. Look, I'm perhaps not as cynical. I don't think they're all that bad. 90% of them are, but there are a few who, are genuinely good communicators.
And they generally say no to interviews because their people won't let them anywhere near us.
But there are some people who, what do they say? If you can't pull off authenticity in politics, you've got to fake it. There are some who are genuinely authentic, and they're the ones that you're drawn to.
No, but I have to ask, who are they? Who are the ones who are authentic?
Well, I would say that Malcolm Turnbull has been someone who I've enjoyed interviewing over many years. I'm not sure how that'll change now that he's Prime Minister. I've done one with him since he was PM, and I quite enjoyed that as well, because he's a natural. It goes to this authenticity. You get the sense when you're sitting there with him that he is genuinely listening to your question and trying to answer it. Now, yes, there are layers of spin in the answer and getting to things that he wants to and doesn't want to say, and I reckon that's going to get more and more carefully prepared each answer now that he is PM. But over the years, I've found him someone really enjoyable to interview. Trying to think of some others. I mean, there are genuinely there are quite a few.
Can I chuck in a name? It's probably one that doesn't come immediately to people's minds, but I think a really good communicator is Barnaby Joyce.
Yeah,
look,
I agree. He's fun to interview because you never know
what he's going to say.
That's true. And that's the beauty of it.
Nor does he. I mean,
perhaps.
Even after he's said it often.
Yeah. But there is at least a naturalness. You get a sense with him that he can speak in visual terms. He can paint a picture. You can see the thing he's describing, which is a great skill. Yeah. And it seems to have been beaten out of a lot of our politicians through the spin doctors who get to them.
I think the thing about Barnaby Joyce that's refreshing is you do get the sense that he has conviction behind what he's saying, that he really believes it and is very passionate about it. He's one of the only members, correct me if I'm wrong here, in the coalition who has gone off script quite a bit.
Yeah, certainly at the cabinet level.
And certainly had to be reined in for stating his point of view, which may have not exactly fit the prevailing kind of perspective in the party. So that is refreshing, and that is the kind of thing that's nice to be able to uncover, because you want to know what's coming from, their real, what is their real sort of passion in politics rather than what
there are some more at the junior level too. Before they get into a ministry or a front bench role and they have to then toe the line. I mean, people like Doug Cameron would always say what he thought. Less so now, but he used to be a terrific guy to interview. Again, some of them don't want to do too much media, but those who are still on their way up or someone who are not looking for promotion, they can be really interesting, fun to interview as well, because they'll tell you what they honestly think.
But isn't it an issue about the form and the time you have, and the restrictions of your format, and how much you would get from a conversation if you actually had several hours with them?
And I think that's a good point about what you want to get from an interview. Now, I think there are probably two things here. I reckon viewers love a combative interview or something unexpected in an interview. They either want to see the interviewer or the interviewee melt down. They want to see, they're the famous interviews, aren't they? When you look at lists of the great interviews, one or the other has completely lost it and come out of it looking
I can
second
assure you I've got a few on my list that I want to get to.
But what does a journalist want from an interview? Well, yes, you do want a bit of theatre, no doubt. But I want information. I want to actually find something out from the interview. And I've gone into that interview to find that out. It might be 1, 2 or 3 things. And that, might be seen as a boring interview to some people. But from a journalist perspective, if it does give you the answers that you need to fill this story or follow this line that everyone's been wondering about, that's the motivation for me very much.
I get the sense, though, that a lot of political interviews, the motivation is almost extraction. I'm going to try and extract something, some worthwhile piece of information out of you, perhaps that isn't on script. Do you sometimes treat interviews like that?
Oh, absolutely, because it's our job to consider what the audience might want to know from the politician, and often they've come on because they've launched a new policy or something's happened, and it's our job really to inform the public. That's why they're tuning in. They want information, and we have to consider what it is that they're looking for. I'm always thinking, what does the person sitting down at night want to know from this person? And that's kind of what guides my questions and what guides the way I interview a politician. And it is frustrating when you can't penetrate their veneer and get to what it is that has driven them in this way, especially when their messages are inconsistent, perhaps with someone else in the party or with something they've said previously. And what I find, forever interesting is the way, when I consider that when I started in journalism, there was no internet. Yes, I'm that old. And now to think about that there's nowhere to hide for any of us, for the interviewer or the interviewee. Right. Yeah. So something they said, 30 years ago is very easily Googleable. Is that even a word? And, so everyone has to be so careful. Equally, we have to be careful that if we're going to press them on something, we need to be so incredibly well researched and, exhaustively fact-checking things.
And to that point, I mean, I've done interviews where, the person you're interviewing might say something at the start and you think, well, hang on, I don't think that's right.
Yeah, but if I challenge them, I better know.
But this is the Google thing. I've actually gone online, Googled it while we're doing the interview because a lot of what they're saying is really boring.
And, I wish I had
and
that.
found the answer, and then you can come back and go, well, hang on, this is actually,
There's a good example of that I can think of your interview with Matthias Cormann after the last budget, where you quoted something you said was, when Labor announced a deficit of $18 billion, you called it a budget emergency. So what do you call a deficit that's now double that at $35 billion? And the dance...
Unfortunate, is that what he said?
Well...
It's all about the trajectory.
He didn't even concede
it's
that.
all Labor's fault anyway.
That's right.
That's exactly what he said. He didn't concede that it's unfortunate. He tried to somehow shift the turf. And so it became a process of extraction to get an admission that there was at least this duplicity.
That's a good example.
He's
one of the hardest people to interview.
In politics.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you mean to say that?
Yeah,
the Terminator reference?
Yeah.
Matthias Cormann, that was a very interesting interview because I spent 20 years as a business journalist. I'm wired to think very much about the budget from an economic perspective, and so I study budgets gone past, and I am the nerdiest budget reporter because I spend weeks beforehand going through past budgets and talking to accountants and economists, and so by the time I sat there with Matthias Cormann, I could quote chapter and verse I could. If you want to call it a skirmish, which it sometimes is,
which it was,
I could match him because I knew what he was going to say and I knew where it was wrong. And in fact, that interview in particular is interesting on a number of fronts because that was the interview that Malcolm Turnbull said, and Lee's interview with Joe Hockey and mine with Matthias that night. He quoted as too aggressive, both of them. He said we were both too aggressive and that we should be more forensic. And I thought, more forensic? I couldn't have been more forensic. And in fact, as a result, I wrote a piece for The Drum, which I encourage you all to go and read, that went through line by line why what I said was right. And I have since had coffee and lunch and dinner with Matthias Cormann, and we still argue every single line item. He loves... The thing about Matthias is he'll come to it and he will, to his credit, he will never say no. He will always front up. Yep. He loves the
and he
battle.
Will never give you
he
anything.
Will argue his point, and he'll never give you concede any ground. But the thing that upset me about that interview was that it was all true. And just to give one example, Peter Costello started the Charter of Budget Honesty, where they nominated the PFO, all these lovely acronyms, the pre-election fiscal outlook, as the line in the sand, and that they are the figures you can rely on that are apolitical, that can, that actually tell you a snapshot in time, so no one can spin it in their favour, and that we're all supposed to look at this as the ultimate, state of the books. And so then I did that for this interview, and when he said that under Labor debt was, and I had heard this so many times by this stage, debt was going to go to $667 billion, and it was like a ding when he said it. It was, well, hold on a minute, PFO said that there was going to be this, and and so I actually hadn't expected him to hit back so hard, but I had the facts there, and that's when doing your research and really understanding things can work for you.
Which, of course, is a truism in the interviewing. All interviewing, you have to do your research and know what you're talking about. And you were saying yesterday in another session, Ramona, that that's one of the absolute hallmarks of, well, keystones of your interviewing.
Well, I mean, over researching, reading everything, reading things that aren't even relevant to that particular conversation you're going to have. I mean, I was interviewing the world's best writers for a long time, and people, like Gore Vidal or Norman Mailer or Susan Sontag, or people who had a lot of books behind them. And because I hadn't had a literary education, I always was anxious in case someone said, if you'd read my book, whatever it was, you'd know the answer to that. And that's what you never want to hear. You never want to hear the interviewee saying that you'd missed out on something. So it was kind of over-preparedness, anxiety about being shamed in public, but then I discovered that this was the best way to do the best kind of interviews, because you go in and you say, there's nothing you can do or say to me that will cast any doubt on my professionality or my dedication and my interest in your work. And then everything else that goes from that, after that, can be like bad behaviour on the part of the interviewee, is totally their problem and not because of something that you have caused. And then it can be interesting because you're calm and you know that you've done your bit, and everything else is just really a bonus. And I have had some odd, interesting, slightly humiliating experiences with writers who have been kind of bonkers. And it's interesting for the audience to see what they're like. And while they're doing that, I don't say to myself, oh God, how am I going to manage this? People are going to hate me, and they're not, because they're going to see that it's this other person who's they're seeing them in their full flourish. And then I think to myself, well, that's interesting, because this is just, they're interested in this person, not in me. They're interested in the talent, and this is another angle on another slice of the person's personality.
It's just as well there are no bonkers politicians then. The point Ramona's making is a good point, because sometimes the craft of interviewing is allowing that person to be themselves by giving them enough rope. Just by standing back a little bit, being well informed and letting it happen.
Clive Palmer's a fun interview. I don't know why he came to mind.
Yeah, and look, Jackie Lambie too. I mean, there are people who you could absolutely embarrass on air, but I think you're right, sometimes it's better to let them do the talking and guide the interview, but it can be far more revealing.
I want to throw one name at you, Wasim Daray. Does that ring a bell? Wasim Daray is from the organisation Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is an Islamic organisation in Sydney. And both of you did an interview with him, which I went looking for. And
mine was far less aggressive than that.
Well, that's sort of where I'm heading with this.
Well, yeah.
Extraordinary interview, because the issue that both of you wanted to get to the heart of was whether Hizb ut-Tahrir, this Islamic organisation in Sydney, was prepared to condemn the activities of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And I think I'm right in saying that both of you opened with questions along those lines. And he took this opportunity to say, well, wait on. I think before I answer anything, I want to give you a bit of a lecture on the history of the West and the Middle East and why the West is so imperialistic and how this is the problem. You gave him a little bit of space to do it, but Emma, you didn't. You said...
Oh, no, he got it out.
He got it out
a number
eventually,
of times.
but you jumped on him immediately and said, no, wait on, no, you're here to answer questions, and my question is X.
And he would have he would have had the opportunity to say those other things, and that was my point, that I'm the interviewer, not you. I dictate the terms of this interview, not you. And if you've come here to answer my questions, you answer my questions. If you wanted a soapbox on
or
which to say whatever you wanted, then go somewhere else. But if you agree to do an interview, you agree to answer questions. You don't agree to just sit there and pretend to have an interest in what I'm trying to ask you, but actually have no interest in answering because that interview went for 11 minutes.
Yeah.
He would have had plenty of time to say everything he wanted to say. And I had questions that went to the things he wanted to talk about, but I wanted him to first deal with the issues that clearly people were exercised about, because it's still today nobody really understands what his buttery is all about. And unfortunately, for people who thought that that interview was over the top, they ought to look at their website. I mean, the website calls for a caliphate in Australia. I mean, what does that... I wanted to get to those questions. What does that mean? What does that look like? Why? What's wrong with the way society works now? And I had all those questions. And so I was frustrated that we couldn't get to all that. And I tried to get to that, but he still wanted to talk about I've tried to go into different bits, but he just wanted to say what he wanted to say.
But you were completely correct to do that, and I saw that interview, and not enough people say that or ask the question many, many times, because that's your job, to ask the question and not to, be too polite. Or it's not. I said yesterday, it's not a tea party. You're not inviting people to your lounge room and they're your guests. You're actually there to do a job. And I would like to say that when I first started on radio doing political interviews in like a million years ago in the 80s, and the first thing people would say was, she's so aggressive, or why does she use that tone, or they're not used to a woman being challenging and saying, hang on a minute, I'm in charge here. You're here to do this and I'm here to do that. And I had the sense that, you're a woman. He was, had views about, the caliphate, perhaps about the position of women and about whether a man ought to be beholden to a woman's questions like this. That's how I saw it. And I thought you did the perfectly correct thing. And the criticism you got was partly from people thinking, she's not being very nice.
David, you took a different approach. You gave him a little bit of space initially, just to blow off steam and say what he had to say. And then there was a little less of that sort of attack, thrust, cut and thrust.
Yeah, that interview, I'm just trying to remember it, but I guess I approached that interview, which I did before your one, and I watched your one later at the night and enjoyed yours far more as a viewer than mine. But I approached mine in the afternoon. I'm just saying that because we're all sitting here and being nice, but I did. I approached that interview in the afternoon with, I tried to drop all my, as I guess you meant to, your own ideological views on these things, and think, okay, well, these guys have some pretty extreme and, uncomfortable views on things, but do they deserve to, have a say, give their position on this topic? Yes, and then we can get into challenging it. So I guess that was my approach, get it out there and then get into challenging those views and trying to get some answers. So I guess that's how I did it. It did get fairly aggressive towards the end of the interview, and I don't know about you, but I come out of something like that feeling a little, your adrenaline's certainly coursing at the end of something like that. And I wouldn't say it's an enjoyable interview to do, but I guess I was trying to at least allow him to say his, fairly off views on things, but get that out and then get into the contest.
I think that at the end of that interview, the director kept laughing that he just wanted to keep cutting back to us because we went to a package piece and he and I were still going, and he said he wanted to just keep cutting back to us still. But it became just a chat. And for him, it was more theatre than it was for me, is what I discovered.
Absolutely.
Because at the end of it, he said to me, look, if you really want answers to your questions, here's my number, give me a call.
Yeah.
And then he went and had his photo taken with B1 and B2 in the entrance of the ABC. I kid you not.
They don't ask questions, so...
But it actually, because it was live and we have to sit there before the show starts, he sort of was very defensive before we even started. He sat down and I said hi and shook his hand, and he and I was, this is what's interesting for me too. I don't know about you when you're doing an interview with someone, not a politician because they're very good at doing small talk, but for other people who aren't necessarily practiced in interviewing. You don't want to lose all your best material by having a pre-conversation, and then they think they've told you everything. So when the camera's rolling, they're never as good if you start asking them those questions ahead of time. So I had to think quickly about what we'd talk about while we were waiting for the cameras to roll. And so I said to him, so tell me a little bit about you. Were you born here, or are you first generation Australian, or were you born overseas, whatever? And he just looked at me like, why are you asking me these questions? And I said, I'll make this easy on you. My parents were born in Italy and I was born here. Your turn. You know? And he was like just really kind of, whoa, why do you want these personal things? I think he was just a little bit tense and on edge from the start.
I want to move on from Wasim.a because there are lots of other issues that we could explore. But David, what is metadata? Now,
don't ask me that.
The reason why I'm asking that, of course, is that is the wonderful question that you very simply and genuinely put to George Brandis, and then what we watched over the next few minutes was a train wreck.
Yeah.
Where he started off so well with a beautiful analogy that had something to do with a letter.
An envelope and...
Yeah, the contents of the letter won't be metadata, but the address on the envelope is, and then it all fell apart.
It did. Look, I guess that gets back to, not wanting to necessarily get into a fight on air, but just trying to get some information, get the answer. Look, I knew... I did do a bit of... work. I don't get a lot of time, I've got to confess, to prepare for interviews. That one, in fact, was a good example of one that was locked in. I think it was, in fact, less than half an hour before we did it. I mean, yes, I'd been putting in requests for the day or two leading up to it because this was a hot topic, and I'd been talking to people and some of his cabinet colleagues as well about their concerns on what they were doing with metadata, and talking to a couple of, just in my general day-to-day covering politics, doing all that. So then finally we got the interview confirmed, he sits down, and that was the obvious question because I knew there was a big cloud over that definition of what metadata is. And as soon as you got that first answer, you could tell he didn't know the definition. He hadn't, worked out exactly what they were targeting.
Because that's what interviewing often is, isn't it? It's being able to discern that crack. It's often an inflection in the voice, and it's a crack that says, please open me up and have a look.
It's exactly right. That is exactly what it is. You see it, and you don't get it in every interview. In fact, I do them every day, and it's pretty rare that you do. But 1 in 10, 1 in 15, you will get that crack. And then it's deciding, okay, do you forget everything else you've prepared here and dive into that crack or not? Because I had like a stack of questions on all sorts of things but as soon as we saw that crack.
But the other remarkable thing I think about that interview was that it disproved the rule that I think applies in a lot of questioning in Australia, where we've got a kind of culture where you can ask the same difficult question perhaps 3 times, maybe 4. After that, you're really pushing it. The audience, you'll feel are beginning to turn on you as the interviewer.
Yep.
But there you could just keep going. And the reason why you kept going is because you genuinely wanted to know what he was about.
I was puzzled.
And it was asked in such a nice manner that the train wreck just kept happening.
Yeah. Well, you're right, though. I mean, it is a difficult balance, and you guys know this. You can ask the same question 3 or 4 times, but then you do have to quickly make a judgment in your mind. Are they just going to keep saying the same thing? I think with that interview, he didn't keep saying the same thing. He kept saying a slightly different contortion of the same thing, and it was just.
But don't you have to
disaster.
then say to the audience, well, clearly you're not answering answering that question.
Yeah.
Like you can't. I don't think you can say, we'll go into another one as if you have answered it.
Yeah.
So, because that's not true,
But
and
a lot
that's
of people
not
do.
honest.
A lot of
I
interviewers
know they do, and that drives me nuts.
But
They
that's
need
like
to
that.
say,
Remember-
you are not answering this, we make that clear, and now I'll ask you something else.
How do you deal with that, Emma?
I was actually going to quote another interview. Was it John Hill, the guy from 10, who asked
The candidate,
that
the
poor
Liberal
candidate,
Yeah.
that poor Liberal candidate about the 6 steps,
The 7
the
steps.
Yeah.
7 steps for the boat policy.
That was
That
really
poor
like
thing.
shooting fish in a barrel, though. That
Yeah,
interview,
that
wasn't
was,
it? That guy was really so underprepared.
Yeah.
But to be fair on the interviewer, that was his constituency, migrants.
Absolutely. It was all about
a lot
the-
of them are refugees.
the boats policy. And
He should have known the boats policy.
Yeah, he was standing for office, and,
And
it
it's not up to
wasn't
you
an
to
aggressive
protect
question.
him. He's standing for office.
But that was
That's all you
really
need
well
to
done.
know.
He just kept asking the same question and revealed so much.
I got the sense, though, with that candidate, that with just a little bit of media training, he would have known enough to know that he didn't need to answer the question. He could have said, well, just give me a second, I'll grab the brochure and I'll show you. You know, there are ways around it. And what happened there was that he hadn't been media trained, which is an issue, something that you encounter all the time, media trained talent.
And
How do you get
But it's
around that?
extraordinary how often, even with politicians who've been there for a while, they'll spout the line, the prepared answer that we're talking about, but then if you scratch it a bit and go, well, okay, but if you do that, does it mean this? And that's when the crack will open. So it's knowing how to scratch below that
And
that
also,
line.
again, the inconsistencies and the inconsistencies with what they said, you know, last week, 10 years ago, and trying to sort of drill down into why there's been a change of heart, if there has been, or if that's something they've been made to do and they don't really feel for the policy. And, you know, that's where, the research is so integral to the process.
Well, when you know what I mean, Matthias Cormann, 4 weeks ago would have been arguing we can't touch superannuation, we can't touch superannuation. Now we've had a change of leader and everything's back on the table. He can't say that that's the reason why his own view has changed, but it is. I mean, you know...
And what is an economic girly man anymore?
Because this is interviewing and part of what we're talking about is you've got to keep asking the question until it gets answered. I'm going to do that. How do you deal with media trained talent?
Look, they're all media trained to varying degrees. And in fact, the training, I think, these days really does involve doing lots and lots of media. And that's lots and lots of Sky and ABC and... you know, as they rise through the ranks, so that by the time they get into a ministerial role, they've done so much of it that they're pretty good at it. And they're the ones who get picked for those roles more and more. How do you break through that? Well, again, it just comes back to research, doesn't it? It comes back to knowing your stuff. And, you know, I'd rarely get more than a few hours confirmation of an interview, but it just means day to day you've got to consume so much information that you are on top of all these portfolio areas as best you can be, so that when you do get the interview, you can drill down and hit them with the detail. That's where they come unstuck.
It is very difficult if you don't have a lot of notice. And with that Wasim interview, I was told he was coming in, and I had no time to prepare, and I hadn't seen your interview. I didn't know what he was on about, so that was all very organic. What you saw was not rehearsed. It wasn't. It
comes back to your day-to-day, you know, reading and consuming of all this stuff, so that you can.
And you have to be curious and consider what, as I said before, what the people at home. But there's another sort of interviewing that we haven't discussed. You might be getting to it, I'm not sure, but I'll put it out there and I'll end it if you're going to get to it. But it's also when you only have one question.
Well, I wasn't going to ask that.
And so I've worked in many situations where you only get one question.
Right.
And that's what we used to call because I spent 5 years at a current affair, and that used to be called the walk-in. So you're going to confront someone who's done something bad, and so you've got all the ducks in a row. You've got all the people who, you know, you've done. Typically, I used to do a lot of in the finance area. You know, people have been dudded, investors in scams and whatever, and you finally track down the con man who's taken millions of dollars from everyone. And you know he's going to run away from you, and you're going to get one question, if that.
So the challenge is to compose the question.
Yeah, and in another situation, I recently did the foreign correspondent on Donald Trump. And so if I was going to get him, I was going to get one question. So I spent 2 weeks thinking about my one question. You know, when you've only got one question, that is really, really hard.
Remind us, what was it?
Oh, well, I didn't get to ask it because he got disinvited from the event that we were supposed to meet at.
Now's your chance.
Oh, it was because it was just after the blood out of the eyes and the blood out of everywhere comment. And I'd been listening to him speak for the whole week. I was there for the Cleveland debate and for all of that, and so we'd been listening to him all week, saying very choice things, particularly about women and minorities and so on. And so my question to him was going to be, aren't you confusing political correctness with old-fashioned good manners?
Good question. We started
I don't
this...
suppose he was going to answer it, though.
We started this session with the premise that interviewing is an act of betrayal and seduction. And I was thinking about that when I saw your interview the other day with Mal Brough, because it started so warmly you know, where you genuinely congratulated him on becoming the Minister, Special Minister for State. But it didn't end so well, did it? In fact, I think the sign-off was quite polite, but along the way you had the temerity to ask him about the allegation about him asking James Ashby to copy the diary.
It's not an allegation because he admitted it.
Yeah.
He admitted it on
then you quoted a finding from a federal court, I think,
Yes.
and then all mayhem ensued.
Yes. Well, yes, I'm so pleased you brought that up. So, look, Mal Brough is an interesting case in point because it was a massive gamble for Malcolm Turnbull to elevate him back into a ministerial position, obviously not one Tony Abbott was willing to take, because he does have some serious questions hanging over him still in...
And look, that interview exposed that, right? That exposed the big gamble that Turnbull took, where everyone's no longer talking about the Ashby stuff, but he is technically still under federal police investigation.
He is absolutely still under federal investigation. My regret, and this is where when you do live interviews you are so exposed to not knowing everything about a story, and whilst I was very close to that story and trying to get an interview with Mal Brough at the time, and I had tried very hard and he had knocked us all back. He'd knocked everyone back at the time of the story. So I had read the judgment in that case back to front originally. And then again, we had very little notice he was coming on the show that night. So I hadn't kept up to where the case was. I knew the case had been dropped, but I didn't know in the middle that the appeal was won to then... It's a very complicated court case. So basically... the case was all about whether Ashby had a case to pursue or not, and the case. So Mal, they launched a case.
I felt for you because it looked like
it's such a complicated court case that when you're doing an interview and you're trying to get the people at home in the picture and also question him so that the people at home aren't confused, that makes it very difficult when you've got limited time as well.
I was saying I felt for you because I thought at that moment that he discerned that you didn't have that last piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and he
because
exploited
of that. He took full advantage of it.
Yeah.
Has that ever happened to you guys where you've been in the position where you haven't quite had all the bits that you need to nail an interview like that?
Well, that's what David said before. You're in your head going, do I go there? Because I'm not really 100% sure. I know that he got an adverse finding, but and it was cast aside allowing an appeal, but the appeal was dropped. So it was never adjudicated on. Yeah. So that's where he has been able to kind of resurrect his career because there hasn't been a final judgment against him because the original judgment was appealed. Anyway, but the thing on the record is that he asked James Ashby to procure Peter Slipper's diaries, and that's potentially a federal offence which is still hanging over him.
And the audience has no sense of the complexity.
Yeah.
And the sort of pitched warfare that you're trying to fight in a very exposed position to get to the heart of what's going on.
And he in particular has been elevated to a position where he's now in charge of the integrity...
Special Minister of State.
Of institutions and so on. So
let me ask you, difficult moments on air in interviews. What comes to mind? Ramona, have you had difficult moments?
I had a famous interview with Bret Easton Ellis, who I was asked to interview at a writers' festival, and I wasn't a great fan of his work.
You'll have to remind us who he is. I don't.
American Psycho, the book that came in a plastic wrapping. Because it had stuff about cannibalism and all kinds of stuff, and he was the sort of bad boy of sort of 80s, I suppose, early 90s, and I wasn't a great fan of his work, and they really, really wanted me to interview him for this big festival, and I thought, oh, well, I haven't interviewed him before, and okay, because, you can't always do, it can't just be the What Ramona Koval Likes to Read show. I thought, oh, well, I need to, extend myself a bit. So I read his books, which I, thought were really awful. And but then I was told I could ring him up at 10 to 2, and we would discuss the gig before we were going to go in front of a big audience to do it, and so it would be recorded as live. And I rang him and we had this conversation, and he said, I said, so what do you want to do? This is your event, people here to see you. He said, I'm happy, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I've read all your work, and it's a literary festival, and they'll want to talk about writing and your books and all of that stuff, and I've read it all, and I'm why don't we do that since it's a literary festival? And he said, that'd be fantastic, let's do that, absolutely. And then I thought, it's very nice. And when we got to the setup, he didn't turn up for the sound check, and he arrived about 2 minutes to the hour, and I went up to him and just to say hello, and these people went, please, 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 we do not speak to Bret Easton Ellis before the performance. I went, what? I've already spoken to him. No, he has to centre himself. And I thought, Jesus, I'm dealing with a prima donna kind of bad boy. What is that? And so I thought, okay, so we get on stage, and then the sound guy has to mic him up in front of the whole audience because he hasn't been there and hasn't allowed it. And I thought, you're a bit of a dick, actually, aren't you? Anyway, so we begin.
Is that your first question?
No, not at all. It became my third question, though, it turned out. But
she eased him in.
So I asked him the first question. I introduced him, asked him the first question, and he goes. He doesn't answer it at all, and he sort of says, "Now, who's that singer that had Hodgkin's lymphoma at one point, and a very attractive girl?"
Yes. Delta Goodrem.
Delta Goodrem. He says, Delta Goodrem. God, she's hot. Delta Goodrem. I was in my hotel room, and I thought, God, she's hot. Delta Goodrem. And I thought, you are not going to play with me. This is going to be like... Wow. And I thought...
This was your Mark Latham moment.
It was. And I thought, am I going to be the fall guy for this guy? And I thought, no, because actually we had a conversation beforehand, and if he hadn't actually asked me to have a conversation about what we were going to do, then I might have had a different attitude. But I got that, and then I think I asked the second question, and I got the same kind of dismissal. And then I said, you don't really want to have a conversation with me, do you? What would you rather do? Would you rather do a stand-up or something? And I just sort of called him on it, I suppose.
What did he say?
I can't really quite remember what he said, but it was a kind of tense thing, and I thought,
But your strategy was to call it for what it was.
My strategy was to call it and not go along with it, because I thought he was not being genuine. This was not really him, and I thought by calling it, perhaps we could see a little bit more about what he was really like. And I had the choice, of course, to come home and say it was such a... No, let's not play it. No, I thought, we're going to play it. So I broadcast it as it wasn't cut at all, and I just thought, I just want the audience to see what a prat he is.
Yeah. Have you had a Mark Latham experience, David, that you'd like to share? Have you had something where it's all gone wrong?
Look, not all gone wrong. You have your inevitable technical problems, or we can't hear what they're saying if they're in another studio, or if you're on an outside broadcast and protesters or people screaming at you off camera, or, all of that's fun. The most awkward things for me, because I've kind of balanced, I've got a twin role of doing interviews every day, but then also as political editor having to cover the news and break stories when I can, and I rely very heavily on sources. Now, can I tell you, a lot of the sources that I talk to across both parties are also people who end up in the chair and I'm interviewing them, right? And on one level, you don't want to burn them too badly because you need them as a good source for everything that's going on day to day. But on the other hand, you can't treat them with kid gloves or any softer when they're sitting there in the interview chair.
Sounds like you shouldn't have both jobs to me.
Well, that's an interesting point. I think this is kind of where the media's gone, and I don't see why you should just be one or the other. I don't think interviewers need to necessarily be pristine and not have an opinion or a job reporting on the news at all, because that might cloud their interviewing ability. I think
But you
journalists...
just said you do.
No, it's something that you've got to balance, right? I think it's something that, as a professional journalist, you've got to be able to do both.
But you can never really say as an interviewer, I'm worried about asking you these questions because you may not be able to furnish me with something later.
No, I'm
because
saying
that is actually not what we're supposed to do.
I entirely agree with David, because I'm in the same situation.
But maybe you both shouldn't be in that situation.
No, but you are in that situation.
I'm not saying it stops me asking that question. I don't think it ever has.
No, you just have to be... But there is no way around it, because on the one hand, we wouldn't get the information, or on the other hand... And if we don't have the information, then the other person... The information they're giving us helps us better interview this person.
I know,
because it exposes
but they
this
should be giving
person.
that information to somebody else who's the...
No, but invariably someone else
works.
is giving information about them.
Journalists don't share that sort of information. That's not how journalism works.
No, but your political editor could be able to tell you something that they got from their sources.
No, journalists don't share, but they don't.
Well, they're your political editor, and they are making you... They should be making you... be able to do the best job you can do.
Well, it's an interesting point, but it's just not how it works.
It's not how it works now because of what? Because of funding cuts? Because of shortcuts?
Because of individual kind of pride and... we guard our own.
I mean, I gave the example
earlier
in the George Brandis interview of talking to sources and getting as much information as I can. Now, yes, some of those sources might be, obviously not George Brandis on that occasion, but they might be some of his cabinet colleagues. Now, to get a full flavour and detailed understanding of that, I need to talk to them. I can't put myself in a bubble and never talk to anyone and then come out and do an interview.
Because you wouldn't have the information. When you're doing a technical interview about the communications portfolio or about... I mean, I dread communications, immigration and climate change, because they're so complicated and you need so much information, and they're the ones generally where you speak to... Well, I do speak to so many people inside the cabinet, advisors, former advisors, you can't
have a staff member do that for you.
Younger ministers, previous ministers, this is what I think is really interesting, that the feedback on Twitter is always, you pretend to know so much. It's like, no, we do know. Because people actually do tell us stuff, but we're not going to come out and say to you, we actually really do know this stuff.
I'm going to go to some questions. That's been truly fascinating listening to that. There's one right at the back there.
Is it on? I just wonder whether some interviewers could do with media training. They ask questions and don't let the person who's interviewing answer the question, e.g. Tony Jones, who I don't listen to anymore. Your comments, please.
That goes to something, though, doesn't it, about how, well, I don't know if aggressive is the word, but how often do you butt in and interrupt? And that is a judgment call with every interview I do, and I'm sure it's the same for everyone. It's, there are going to be viewers who hate it every time you butt in. There are going to be viewers who hate it every time you don't butt in. And it really just depends on the interview. I can guarantee you that if I'm interviewing someone from Labor, every time I butt in, all the Labor sympathisers will get stuck right into me. I mean, that's just...
And can you never get it right. Can you imagine interviews with politicians without butting in? My God, how boring.
Yeah, boring snoring again. Yeah. Look, the problem is that because they are so well trained to not answer the question, but to give the appearance of answering the question, which makes it terminally frustrating, because to the viewers at home, you kind of think they maybe did answer the question, but we are so trained to listen to what they're saying that we know they didn't answer the question at all or even go anywhere near it. And it's interesting what you say about Malcolm, because I find him one of the most frustrating people to interview, because, and Lee and I have had this discussion before about him, he does two things that irk us both incredibly, because they know time is premium in our business, and that we have someone in our ear going 5, 4, and you're going, Christ, I've only done 2 questions and I've got 7 more, hurry up and answer it. And so Malcolm has a way of going, and we've both identified this, he'll go, at the end of his answer, he'll go, let me give you an anecdote. Oh, don't give me an anecdote. That's going to go for 2 minutes. And you know it's going to go for 2 minutes. I don't have 2 minutes for your anecdote.
He's actually pretty forgiving when you do butt in, though, Malcolm. I think he...
But we both now don't let him do the anecdote.
No,
and the other one is, let me give you an example. And I'll often go, no, that's okay, we understand.
Yeah, and partly because he's a journalist, he gets it. He actually understands it. And I think you're right, it's quite deliberate. He's killing time.
I've had a joke with him before about it, and I've done the whole wave the finger. Don't you give me an example again.
So no more anecdotes, we're taking a question. There's one there.
Was there ever a time when you felt that you betrayed someone, and what happened afterwards?
Betrayal, lovely question.
I don't feel like I've actually betrayed someone. I always feel like I'm doing my job. But there have been times when I've finished an interview with someone that I've known for years, and I don't know if you call them friendships with politicians, but you've known them and worked with them and whatnot. And at the end of it, they've just turned on me and said, "Mate, you used to be a good journalist," and they know how to cut you to the core.
And that's when you know you've done a really good job.
Yeah, exactly. But they are filthy and they won't talk to you for a long time.
You have to have a thick skin, don't you, in this business?
Yeah,
it's
but
absolutely
on both
imperative.
sides. Yeah.
Question there.
Look, I'm delighted with this conversation and the way you're moving along, but you do your research and so on, but do you think that there's a tendency these days in journalism that research isn't being done, that there are people there asking questions that really don't know the background and so on? I mean, I've seen this sort of level. What do you think of that sort of proposition?
I think there are constraints, time constraints. We've both talked about sometimes when you only have an hour's notice, half an hour's. If I have hour's notice, that's only enough time to get my hair and makeup done. So it's a real issue that we don't have a lot of time to sit in front of a computer and Google and try to check things. And if people say they're coming on in an hour, so there are some constraints to the amount of research you do. And because we scope around so many different topics, trying to stay across everything can be overwhelming, although we obviously try very hard to do that.
But that's not to say there isn't also laziness.
Yeah.
I'm sure there is some. I'm sure there is some laziness out there, but for mine...
Laziness in journalism? No.
I can't stand it when I can hear that the person hasn't done the reading. They don't know what the book is about. They don't really know much about the person who's been shoved in front of them. I just don't want to hear that.
I think not doing research is quite disrespectful to the person that you're
It
interviewing.
is,
but
but
there are limits, I think.
But I think I've eschewed the limits of the form. If it's going to be limited because of the time constraints, I don't want to hear that either. I much prefer to read a long essay or read a book or go somewhere else and not have a kind of empty conversation to listen to.
Let's go to another question here.
In the past, there was programs that had really long interviews, particularly with politicians and so forth, as opposed to these doorstop interviews that we have now. Do you think that they are degrading the quality of the conversation that we're able to have?
So less long-form interviews in journalism.
Yes.
I don't know if there is less.
There's still,
There's still 7:30 and late line and
your
dated.
interviews
That's short.
My interviews are shorter than they were last year, but we used to do 18-minute
Why are they
interview.
shorter?
Because our show's shorter. We've gone from a 40-minute show to a 30-minute show.
I think it's probably best not to start Emma on that one.
No, I think that's I think it's interesting.
Well, no. There's been a decision made that we should do 2 interviews a night rather than 1. So that means we've got 2 shorter ones rather than 1 really long one. And I think often that's a better call because we can still give 2 people 10 minutes each, which is still a long interview.
I just really regret the loss of those 18-minute interviews with Erica Betts. They were wonderful.
You'd be about the only one.
Hi. I'm just wondering how you cope with conflict within the interview in the context of the interviewee turning on you. When they might challenge your journalism or your professionalism or something like that, and you see it occasionally. How do you, I guess experience comes into it, but not getting flustered or not sort of, I'm a journalist and I'm sort of young in my career, so that's part of the struggle for me is overcoming those feelings of feeling flustered.
That's a great question.
I think the preparation issue is the thing that will save you. Because you know in your heart, in your guts, that there is nothing more you could have done to prepare yourself for this. You've got nothing to apologise for. you've got nothing to feel ashamed of or to be demeaned about, and this is a strategy that they are using to make you feel like this, and you have to resist that because they're trying to make it impossible for you to continue your job.
Experience is part of it too.
There's one politician in particular who likes to say, so if he doesn't like something I've said, he'll go, with respect. You know who I'm talking about?
The other favourite line, and both sides use
and you
it.
know that what's about to come is not very respectful at all.
No, correct. The other favourite line is, if it's a Labor politician you're talking to, or they're just Liberal talking points you're spouting, or if it's a Liberal politician, they're just Labor talking points that you're propagating.
Which is what Matthias Cormann said to me at that post-budget interview. Well,
and
you're
that's
just sprouting
designed
the Labor line.
Yeah, exactly. It's obviously designed to suggest that the interviewer is biased against them politically and throw you off. Look, you've got to be prepared for that. You've got to just be prepared when they come at you personally like that, which is what it is to double down and go right back at them. Yeah. And that does just take confidence, and it probably takes experience.
Experience is crucial, yeah.
But look, confidence is really the key, that you know what you're talking about and that you're not biased
and you've
you're
rattled
not coming,
them.
You don't have an agenda, this is just your job.
And it usually is a red flag that you've actually hit a raw nerve. So keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good indicator, yeah.
That's official, keep going. We have time really, I'm afraid, for only one more question. Please, there, yes.
Politicians aside, what would you recommend for people who become very emotional in an interview? So I was interviewing a man who was very sick, and I asked him a question about his family, and I could tell he was about to get really, really upset. And being a newbie, I quickly diverted the conversation so he wouldn't become upset. So what would you recommend in a situation like that?
Dealing with emotion.
Yeah, that's happened to me once or twice, and not normally in politics, obviously, but when you're interviewing someone, if it gets to the point where they're that emotional that they're crying, I shut down the interview. I don't see any point in having that go to air live. I move it on, close it down.
Not the case in pre-recorded interviews, is it?
No, because, I don't think you should be afraid of people's emotion. And that is part of being an adult, part of being wise, part of having had life experiences yourself.
But if they're uncomfortable in continuing,
sure,
you've got to stop.
But you don't shut it down. I mean, in a pre-recorded situation we're talking about, not a live situation. But I think you give people a moment or 5 minutes or talk, let them sort of get a sense of themselves again, because often they're there because they want to tell you the story and they want to go on. And they become overcome, and then you're sympathetic, and you ask whether they want to keep talking and whether they want a glass of water, you go on.
I do think it has happened to me before.
And you can cut that bit out. You don't have to have that go to air.
Actually, a very simple "Are you okay?" during the interview is a signal to them. Do you want to keep going? And you let them make that decision about whether they want to keep going, whether they want you to conduct the interview at all, or whether they... I think that if that's their reaction, then often it's up to them. Because sometimes they do want to continue and they're just... It's hit something that then if they do want to continue, rather than going into another direction, to explore what it is can often be quite a powerful interview because whatever that's bringing up for them, they do want to talk about. But I think asking them if they're okay and being human and going with that sort of instinctive reaction can work.
Because if you change tacks, it's a signal to them that you're embarrassed about their emotion, that they shouldn't have been upset, and now you have to kind of go on another direction, and it's kind of shameful, and that's not what you want.
Well, sometimes interviewing means being a bit brutal and cutting things off when they should still be going for quite some time, but perhaps because we're about to get emotional, I don't know. My job now is to terminate this interview. I'm sorry about that. We've just had a masterclass in interviewing, and please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.
And thank you, Andrew, for interviewing.